Welcome to CMES Conversations, a series of interviews with leading scholars and thinkers hosted by the University of Denver's Center for Middle East Studies. Today, Associate Professor Nader Hashemi will speak with Fred Hof, a resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. On March 28, 2012, President Obama conferred the rank of ambassador on him in connection with his duties as special advisor on Syria. Hof was previously the special coordinator for regional affairs in the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, where he advised Special Envoy George Mitchell. He is the author of Galilee Divided, The Israel-Lebanon Frontier, 1916 to 1984. Line of Battle, Border of Peace, The Line of June 4th, 1967, and Beyond the Boundary, Lebanon, Israel, and the Challenge of Change. Thank you for joining us once again on this episode of CMES Conversations.
I'm very happy to be here with Ambassador Fred Hof, speaking about U.S. foreign policy towards Syria. Ambassador Hof will be speaking in about 1 hour from now at the University of Denver on the topic of ISIS, Syria, and U.S. foreign policy. Ambassador Hof, welcome to the University of Denver.
It's a great pleasure to be with you today.
I want to begin by really just thanking you for all that you have written and said on U.S. foreign policy towards Syria. Many Syrians that I know have taken quite a bit of comfort and view that your writings on Syria as perhaps the most morally clear and profound voice in terms of what U.S. foreign policy could be and should be. And as one of my friends said to me the other day, you know, when this is all over, hopefully, there's a boulevard or a street named Fred Hof somewhere in a democratic Syria that could be named and should be named. So thank you for being here, and thank you for...
Well, thanks, and I thank you for your comments. I'd just be content to see a Syria at peace and united and governed with some sense of the consent of the governed playing a role.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, let's talk about U.S. foreign policy towards
Sure.
Syria under President Obama. And let's go back to the beginning. And I
Sure.
guess my broad question really is, you know, what went wrong? And I phrased the question, what went wrong, because President Obama comes into office, and there was a lot of hope and anticipation that when met with serious moral and political challenges, atrocities, war crimes, given his attachment to Samantha Power, given sort of where he came from, that he would sort of rise to the occasion and do the right thing. But when he was tested, in the case of Syria, he moved in a direction that sort of disappointed many of us. How do you explain President Obama's sort of, you know, entire approach to the question of Syria? How would you interpret it for us?
Yeah, I think there are probably a couple of elements to the explanation. First of all, I think that when the violence began in Syria in March 2011, the expectation of the president and people around him in the White House was that Bashar al-Assad was not going to be lasting very long. After all, if people as distinguished, if you will, as Hosni Mubarak, Muammar Gaddafi, President Saleh of Yemen, Ben Ali of Tunis, if they were all being swept aside by the gale force winds of the Arab Spring, how was Bashar al-Assad going to resist these forces? So initially, there was a belief that Assad would be swept aside. And in fact, there was a high premium in the White House in getting the president on record, calling for Assad to step aside before he was pushed. Hence the August 18th, 2011 statement. When it became clear in the months that followed that Assad was not going anywhere, that he had some real resources, that by making this a sectarian conflict and falling back on his own sectarian base, he was actually going to have some staying power. And at that point, it became a question of, okay, he's not going to step aside. what is the United States going to do to make it happen? And it was then that President Obama's basic resistance to the exercise of American power in the region kicked in, because for him and for many of his associates, the invasion and occupation of Iraq starting in 2003 was the great lesson of American foreign policy. So I think that's why the administration opted to take an arm's length approach.
Yeah, I get this question quite a bit when I give talks on Syria. People look back and they say, well, at what moment could have the United States intervened in some significant way that could have altered the course of the war and led to a better outcome? Is there, looking back over the period from March 2011 moving forward, are there any sort of particular events and moments where, if we could roll the clock back, perhaps it would have made a difference had there been some sort of external intervention or emphasis or push to change things? Does anything stick out in your mind?
Yeah, in my mind, there are three things. First, when the violence started. I'm not sure the United States did all it could to try to dissuade Bashar al-Assad from following this course.
What could have it done, for example?
There had been a lot of work leading up to March 2011 in the direction of trying to create a foundation for an Israeli-Syrian treaty of peace. Both sides put a lot of effort into this. I happened to be the mediator between them, doing some shuttle diplomacy back and forth between Damascus and Jerusalem. I think the United States in March 2011 could have done a better job of explaining to Bashar al-Assad that all of this would go out the window if he continued on his present course. Now, would our diplomatic intervention at that point made a difference? Who knows? But it wasn't tried. And this I think is possibly a big lost opportunity. If you fast forward to the summer of 2012, when the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Director of Central Intelligence Agency, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff all went to President Obama and said, we've got to do something significant to help the nationalist rebels inside Syria. Because in addition to what Assad is doing to Syrian civilians, we now have indications that remnants of Al-Qaeda are beginning to spring up in different parts of Syria. We need to move forthrightly to support these forces, to suppress these other developments. The president decided against it. And finally, August, September 2013, in the wake of these horrific chemical attacks in Damascus, the United States had an opportunity then and perfect justification at very low cost to neutralize the Assad regime's tools of terror, Air Force, Scud missiles, artillery, and so forth. And that was passed up.
So how do you explain that? I mean, that's the big question. That was the moment when the world was watching. There was a lot of global support that this sort of, his red line that President Obama had repeatedly claimed if it was crossed, there would be consequences. It looked like he was about to intervene, even in a symbolic way, but then he turned it over to the Russians and they defused this situation, and arguably we can see now President Assad grew stronger as a result. So could you give us a sense of what the calculation was in the White House, that very fateful moment? I think when people look back on this time.
One of the great and consistent hallmarks of this Syrian crisis has been unintended consequences. The president, I suspect, from the beginning of the chemical crisis, still harbored this essential skepticism based on the experience in Iraq that the application of American force would somehow backfire on us, that it would put us on a slippery slope, that there would be mission creep and so forth. In this sense, the president, I think, was looking at these matters in a rather disinterested academic way, rather than as commander-in-chief who would actually have control over what kinds of forces would be deployed and how far this operation would go. But his skepticism kicked in, and at the last minute, really without the benefit of an interagency deliberative process, he decided suddenly to refer the matter to Congress, which was tantamount to dropping it. And the unintended consequence here is, yes, chemical weapons were removed from Syria, but it gave Bashar al-Assad a new lease on life, and he doubled down in terms of civilian terror, using more conventional weaponry, and now using barrel bombs that ironically contain chemical canisters in the form of chlorine.
So that was the calculation at that time. I remember reading the larger debate. Many people were arguing that, look, yes, Syria was a horrific humanitarian and moral crisis, but it didn't significantly affect U.S. national strategic assets and interests in the region. We could contain Syria. But as we've seen now, looking back, that the argument about containing Syria within its borders has been an argument that just doesn't stand up to scrutiny, because as a result of, I would say, the absence or the failure of U.S. policy and international policy on Syria, we've got ISIS.
Yeah,
and so now it's a global crisis.
Indeed, and from the beginning, it was not containable.
Right.
All right. You had American allies and friends in the region being affected very, very negatively by the implosion of Syria. You had refugees streaming across into Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan in particular. So my sense is that even if you approach this purely from a foreign policy realist perspective, even if the humanitarian aspect of it doesn't mean very much to you, American interests were engaged from the beginning of this. It obviously became heightened when in June of 2014, operating from secure bases in Syria, ISIS swept virtually unimpeded through major parts of Iraq, and that has brought American military force back into the picture, ironically enough.
So you've been critical of this Iraq first strategy in confronting ISIS, and you've argued for a Syria first strategy. Could you tell us what exactly you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that I think that where ISIS is the most vulnerable right now is actually in Syria. This is its rear area. This is its logistical base. This is its headquarters. The practical problem we're facing right now is that in Iraq, in addition to the air attacks being executed by this U.S. coalition led by the United States, there are ground combat components of various types and various flavors. It's an axiom of military science that the way victory is achieved over ground forces is with ground forces. You have to have them. You cannot defeat this kind of an enemy from 30,000 feet. So what's required in Syria is a ground force. But if we were to concentrate on Syria first, if we were able to persuade some of the regional powers to join us in an effort that would sweep ISIS from eastern and central Syria, you would not only do major and perhaps fatal damage to this horrible organization, but you could also end up setting the stage for real political transition in Syria. You could actually build within Syria a governmental alternative to the Assad clan in Damascus, which frankly is just being propped up at this point by Iran.
Yeah. Well, that raises the question, if we were to pursue this Syria first strategy as you outlined it, it would require the United States and the international community to confront Putin and Khamenei in a very serious way. Could that be practically done, given the sensitivity over the Iran nuclear negotiations, given the challenges that Putin is posing in Eastern Europe? How would that practically manifest itself in terms of U.S. policy?
It's an excellent question, and I should perhaps interject here that this perhaps has also been a factor from the beginning in staying the hand of the President of the United States in the face of some unbelievable humanitarian outrages in Syria. Iran has played a major role in helping the Assad regime to survive and in facilitating the basic survival strategy of the Assad regime, which centers on terrorizing and killing large numbers of civilians. So I think, again, from the beginning, one of the things that's constrained the President of the United States is perhaps his sense that if we push back in Syria, the Iranians may be offended and may walk away from the whole nuclear negotiations process.
Right.
I personally believe that is an incorrect calculation. But if this is the President's calculation, that of course is what's important. So even now, even as President Obama tells Tom Friedman of the New York Times that the barrel bombing of children and the displacement of human beings is now a core interest of the United States in the Middle East, even as he says that, he has to face the question of what would be the Iranian reaction to this. Now, Iran seems not to have a parallel problem.
Right.
The supreme leader is quite happy to authorize a Quds Force presence in Syria, which is basically organizing the defense of the Assad regime, while he also authorizes the foreign minister to conduct nuclear negotiations with the United States. Iran is able to compartmentalize these things on the basis of its interests.
Right.
The question is whether or not the United States will be willing and able to do this.
Just to push you a little bit more on that, does the nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran provide greater opportunities to sort of push the Iranians and push forward with a more robust Syria policy now that that issue seems to be resolved?
Well, it's not necessarily resolved, and this could be the challenge. We have what seems to be a rather loose framework agreement, on basic principles. There's supposed to be a final detailed agreement by June 30th of this year. So, to the extent President Obama still feels constrained about doing anything in Syria for fear of offending the Iranians, June 30th may just be another extension, if you will, of this nightmare.
Right. Well, I could spend all day talking to you, Ambassador Hof. I really, appreciate the time that you've given us, and really have benefited once again from your very important, precise, and morally clear sort of writings on U.S. foreign policy towards Syria. Thanks for all that you're doing, and thanks for being here today.
It's been a great pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful, thanks.
Take care.